Unique world for scholars. Please subscribe to this channel and click on the bell icon for latest notifications. Like and share videos and express your opinion in the comment section.
Dying to Win: The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism by Robert Pape. Chapter 2 Part 1 Explaining Suicide Terrorism. My study assesses the record of suicide terrorism in the state and global responses to it over the past 20 years, with a view to explaining how and why suicide terrorism has occurred and persisted, why the incidence is rising, how far the menace is likely to spread, and what can be done to contain it. Although no approach can predict the future with absolute certitude, a comprehensive analysis of the history and causes of suicide terrorism affords us the opportunity to ground our policies in a real knowledge. My general propositions hold across a wide variety of circumstances and account for a large portion of suicide terrorism, but they have limits. My arguments are meant to account for modern suicide terrorism, especially the increasing use of suicide attack by terrorist groups from the early 1980s to the present. Modern suicide terrorist groups share a number of features. In general, they are weaker than their opponents. Their political goals, if not their tactics, are broadly supported by a distinct national community. The militants have a close bond of loyalty to comrades and devotion to leaders. And they have a system of initiation and rituals signifying an individual's level of commitment to the community. Modern suicide terrorist groups may receive material assistance from states that share some of their political aspirations, but they are independent actors who rarely follow the dictates of others blindly. Perhaps most important, modern suicide terrorism is highly lethal because the attacker's purpose is not only to die, but to use their deaths to kill the maximum number of people from the opposing community. These commonalities make it possible to develop a general theory of modern suicide terrorism. However, the account I offer for the origins of suicide terrorism should not be viewed as a general explanation for terrorism as a whole. Ordinary, non-suicide terrorism is significantly different. It occurs under a wider variety of circumstances, for a wider variety of goals, with wider variation in the use of destructive force and in sympathy from the terrorists' national community. In addition, non-suicide terrorism is often used by groups far smaller than those using suicide terrorism. Accordingly, we should not expect the same factors to account equally well for suicide and non-suicide terrorism. I have set aside the broader problem of terrorism in general in order to concentrate on the specific causes of the deadlier threat, suicide terrorism. What is suicide terrorism? Terrorism involves the use of violence by an organization other than a national government to intimidate or frighten a target audience. In general, terrorism has two broad purposes: to gain supporters and to coerce opponents. Most terrorist campaigns seek both outcomes to some extent, often aiming to change the target state's policies while simultaneously mobilizing support and recruits for the terrorist's cause. Sometimes terrorism directed at outsiders can also be a way of competing with rival groups for support within the same social movement. However, there are trade-offs between these objectives, and terrorists can strike various balances between them. These choices represent different forms of terrorism, the most important of which are demonstrative, destructive, and suicide terrorism. Demonstrative terrorism is as much political theater as violence. It is directed mainly at gaining publicity, for any or all of three reasons: to recruit more activists, to gain attention to grievances from soft-liners on the other side, and to gain attention from third parties who might exert pressure on the other side. Groups that emphasize ordinary, demonstrative terrorism include the Orange Volunteers Northern Ireland, National Liberation Army Colombia, and Red Brigades Italy. Hostage-taking, airline hijacking, and explosions announced in advance are generally intended to bring issues to the attention of the target audience. In these cases, terrorists often avoid doing serious harm, so as not to undermine sympathy for the political cause. Brian Jenkins captures the essence of demonstrative terrorism. Terrorists want a lot of people watching, not a lot of people dead. Destructive terrorism is more aggressive, seeking to coerce opponents with the threat of injury or death as well as to mobilize support for the cause. Destructive terrorists seek to inflict real harm on members of the target audience at the risk of losing sympathy for their cause. Exactly how groups strike the balance between harm and sympathy depends on the nature of the political goal. For instance, the Baader-Meinhof group selectively assassinated rich German industrialists, acts that alienated certain segments of German society but not others. Palestinian terrorists in the 1970s often sought to kill as many Israelis as possible, fully alienating Jewish society but still evoking sympathy from Muslim communities. Other groups that emphasize destructive terrorism include the Irish Republican Army, Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia (FARC), and the 19th-century anarchists. Suicide terrorism is the most aggressive form of terrorism, pursuing coercion even at the expense of angering not only the target community but neutral audiences as well. What distinguishes a suicide terrorist is that the attacker does not expect to survive the mission and often employs a method of attack such as a car bomb, suicide vest, or ramming an airplane into a building that requires his or her death in order to succeed. In essence, suicide terrorists kill others at the same time that they kill themselves. The classic model of suicide attack that we most commonly think of today includes only situations in which the attacker kills himself or, increasingly among the Tamil Tigers and Palestinians, herself. A broader definition could include any operation that is designed in such a way that the terrorist does not expect to survive it, even if he or she is actually killed by police or other defenders. We might call such operations suicide missions instead of suicide attacks. An example would be the February 1994 Hebron massacre. Its perpetrator, Baruch Goldstein, had no plan for escape, left a note indicating he did not expect to return, and simply continued killing Palestinians until some of his victims brought him down. Such suicide missions have occurred in a number of conflicts, as in the cases of Palestinians who invade Israeli settlements on the West Bank with guns and grenades, intending to kill the inhabitants. Few of these assailants escape alive. This book counts only suicide attacks that meet the classic definition, partly because it is the common understanding of the concept, and partly because suicide missions are hard to identify reliably since we rarely know for certain that an attacker who did not kill himself or herself actually expected to die. In any event, including those suicide missions of which we can be confident would not change my basic findings. In principle, suicide terrorism could be used for demonstrative purposes or could be limited to targeted assassinations. In practices, however, recent suicide terrorists often seek simply to kill as many people as they can. Although this maximizes the coercive leverage that can be gained from terrorism, it does so at heavier cost than other forms of terrorism. Maximizing the number of enemy killed alienates virtually everyone in the target audience, including those who might otherwise have been sympathetic to the terrorist's cause. In addition, the act of suicide creates a debate and often loss of support among moderate segments of the terrorist's community, although it may also attract support among radical elements. Thus, while coercion can be one of the aims of any form of terrorism, Coercion is the paramount objective of suicide terrorism. The history of suicide terrorism. The forms of suicide terrorism that concern us most today: a driver detonating a car laden with explosives near a large, inhabited building, or a person exploding a suicide vest in a busy marketplace were practically unknown before 1980. Instances of suicide terrorism did occur earlier, although these were mainly suicide missions rather than suicide attacks, and were much less common than they are now. The three best known of these earlier suicide campaigns were those of the ancient Jewish zealots, the 11th and 12th century assassins, and the Japanese kamikazes during World War II.